Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'll be showing you how to create an isometric 3D map using GIMP. This is GIMP version 2.10.8, which is the latest version of GIMP at the time of this tutorial. But of course, before we get into that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, we have tons of GIMP video and text tutorials on here, so definitely check that out. You can also enroll in my GIMP 2.10 Masterclass from beginner to pro photo editing on Udemy. And you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. And I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. I'll be using a couple of free images here from Pixabay. So I have this image of an aerial view of some mountains in a landscape. And I also have this photo here of some dirt, which we're going to use for the sides of our 3D cube we're going to be creating. So I'll just minimize the browser window. And here is our final composition. So I'll hold Control and zoom in with my mouse wheel. You can see we have some elements here that look nice in 3D, and the mountains are giving it some really nice dimension as well. And then we've got the dirt here, which is nice and shaded, and it makes the cube look 3D, as well as the shadow right here. And we also have a cool reflection. So this technique or this composition will really work with any aerial photo. So one you grabbed on a stock image website, one you took yourself, or maybe one you grabbed from Google Earth. But let's dive in here. So I'm going to start by coming over to File, and in my case I'll go to Open Recent, and I'm going to choose Isometric Grid 1920-1080. I'll link this file for you guys to download in the description of the video, as well as a tutorial on how to create an isometric grid. So if I hold Control and zoom in, you'll see that our isometric grid is made up of equilateral triangles. And if I come over here and hide one of these layers, you'll see that now this looks more like a perspective grid. So this just creates an easy way for us to draw items and make them 3D all within perspective, which adds to that 3D element. But first I'll start by drawing the first portion of our cube shape. And so I'll come over here and collapse the iso grid layer. And I'm going to click on my background layer and then come down here and create a new layer. And so this one I'm going to name Cube Outline. And I'll click OK. And then I'll come over here and create a second new layer, and I'm going to name this one Cube Fill. And make sure your mode is set to normal and transparency is your fill width. So I'll click OK. And I'm just going to drag the ISO grid below these two layers. And now I'm going to make sure I have my path tool selected here. And I'll hold Control and zoom out. What you need to do is determine how large you want your cube to be. So we're going to draw the first surface of our cube with this path tool. And so I'm just going to click on our isometric grid and create a point. And now I'm just going to come over here and click to create another point. So these are just random points that I'm creating, but I do want to follow the line here because these points need to be on the same line. And you can always drag this node around after the fact if you need to. And I'm very loosely drawing these points right now, so I'm just going to put this point right here and loosely place it. And then I'll come over here, hold Control to create a union between the last and the first points. And I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to how to master the paths tool, so I recommend checking that out if you haven't already. As you can see, these two points are not on the same line, so I'll just click and drag this so that they are. And now we have a rough outline of our cube. I'm going to hold the Alt key to enter move mode and just move this over and move it up a little bit. And now I'll hold Control and zoom in because we need to just really make sure that everything is nice and aligned. So I'm going to align it to the center guide here, and it should snap to that guide. If not, go to View, Snap to Guides. And if you don't have a guide at all, you can go to Image, Guides, New Guide by Percent, and you could choose horizontal first, click OK, then do this again with vertical, and that'll create some center guides. If you downloaded my file or if you followed along with my ISO grid tutorial, you should have the center guides on here. And I'm going to hold Control and zoom in right here. So we don't have guides in this area, so I'm just going to eyeball this, make sure it's nice and aligned there. Hold Control and zoom out. And hold Control and zoom in here. Same thing, just going to make sure this is nice and aligned. It should snap to that center guide. And come over here, hold Control, zoom in, and make sure this is nice and aligned. Now we have the first section of our cube, so we need to go ahead and stroke this path and then fill it. So I'll come over here and first start with the cube outline layer, then come over here and choose stroke path. Make sure your color is set to black here. If not, you can click this icon to reset your foreground and background colors. I'll choose solid color, set the line width to 1, make sure the anti-aliasing is checked. Come over here to line style and make sure this is a straight line, and then click stroke. And now I'll come over here to the cube fill layer, and this time I'll choose fill path. Solid color, it should still be black. You could choose any color you want if you don't like black. And I'll just click fill. And you guys will see why we need a fill and an outline layer as we get into this tutorial a little bit further. But now we need to go ahead and duplicate this because we have the top layer of the cube and we need the bottom layer. So I'll come over here to our Paths tab. And here's the path we just created. You can unhide that. And I'm just going to duplicate this so we have two of them now. And with my path tool still selected, I'm going to hold the Alt key to enter move mode again. And I'll click and drag this. And I'm just using that center guide there to keep this centered as I move it down. How far you move this down depends on how thick you want the cube to look. So I'm going to go with right there. And I'll hold Control and zoom in. And I'm going to use the Alt key just to move this into place. Make sure that that is nice and centered on that center guide there. And then I'm just going to look around the grid and make sure everything is nice and lined up. You can also zoom in here. Come over to your cube fill layer and hide that and make sure that is nice and lined up, which it is. So I'll zoom out. So now we have our two paths here. You can see we have the top path and the bottom path. I'll come over back to the Paths tab and I'm just going to show and hide this to make sure I know which path this is. So this is the bottom one. So I'll put cube bottom and then here I'll put cube top. This is just keeping everything nice and organized. I'll come back over to the layers panel, unhide this cube fill layer for now, and then I'll come over here and create a new layer. I'm going to name this cube fill bottom. Click OK, and then create one more new layer and name this cube outline bottom. Click OK. So I'm going to grab my Paths tool again, come over here to the Paths tab, make sure I'm clicked on the cube bottom path, and I'll start with the outline. So I'll come over here and click stroke path again. All the settings should be the same, and I'll click stroke, and then click fill path, solid color, fill. So now we have the top and bottom layers of our cube. I'm just going to do a little bit of organizing now by putting all these elements into one single layer group. So I'll come over here and create a layer group, and I'm going to come over here and name this cube shapes and hit enter. And now I'll click and drag each of these layers into the layer group. And I'm just making sure that these are in order as I place these in the layer group. You can tell when you're in the layer group because the line right here, the little black line that shows up, will be shorter. You can see right here the line is a little bit longer because it's not in a layer group versus right here it's shorter. So now everything is inside one layer group, and these shapes are going to guide us as we start adding elements into this composition. So now we're going to open up our landscape image. So I'm going to open up my file folder, and I'm going to come over to downloads and just search for that image. And so here it is. So I'll click and drag this into the composition and release. And then I'll drag this in as a layer. Right now it's inside our layer group, which I don't want, so I'm going to click and drag this outside the layer group. And let me just rename this landscape to make things easier. And I'm going to grab my move tool and just move this into place. So as you guys can see, the photo is actually a little bit smaller than our cube right now, and that is not ideal, but we can fix this by grabbing the scale tool. So I'll come over here and click on my scale tool and make sure my interpolation is set to no halo or low halo. So now I'll come over here and click on my image layer with the scale tool, and I'm just going to click and drag while holding the shift key, and that's going to ensure that this scales with the same aspect ratio. So go with about right there, and then I'll come over here and do the same thing. So we want it to be a little bit larger than the cube, but not too much larger. So we're just dragging this until we know for sure that the sides of our image are overlapping the ends of our cube. And the less I scale this up, the more quality will be maintained in the original image. So now I'll come over here and click scale, and that'll scale that up. Now I'll come over here and grab my move tool, and I'm going to move this into place. And you'll see there's a little center plus sign right here, and that is going to snap to the grid. And then we're going to just move this up a little bit. So go with about right there. Now that we've imported our photo, we've scaled it, and we've moved it into place, next we need to mask out the excess areas that are going outside of the boundaries of our cube. So I'm going to come over here to my layers panel, and first off, this is my cube top layer, and I'm just going to come over here and add top here so that we're not confused as we're working on these layers. So now we have our bottom layers here and our top layers here. But I'll come over here to the cube fill top layer, and I'm going to alt click on this layer, which is going to create a selection. And now I'll come over here to the landscape layer, right click, and go to add layer mask. And make sure Initialize Layer Mask 2 is set to Selection, and then click Add. And that will mask out all areas of our image that go outside of that cube area. So that's why we created that cube fill top and cube fill bottom layer, is so we can mask everything out. So I'll hit Control-Shift-A to deselect that area. And I'm also going to come over here to our Paths tab. And I'm actually going to hide our paths because we don't need those right now, and it's just sort of a distraction. And then I'll come back to our Layers panel. So we've masked everything outside of the cube, but the issue with that is that this doesn't look three-dimensional at all. So we need to mask back in some of the three-dimensional areas of our image. So I'm going to come over and hold Control and zoom in a bit. And then I'll grab my brush tool, and I'm going to switch the color over to white. And I'm going to make sure I have a brush with a hardness of 100, so you can click on your brushes here and grab a hard brush. And you can see the hardness right here is turned all the way up to 100. And I'm going to increase the size of my brush using the brackets on my keyboard. And I'm just going to paint some of these mountain areas back in. And this is going to take a couple of goes. But I'm just going to paint some of the area right here. And I actually want this going all the way to the edge of my cube, so I'm just going to paint all the way there. And I also want this area right here to be 3D, so I'll paint some of that in. And we'll keep it there for now. I'll hit the X key on my keyboard to switch over to black, hold Control and zoom in, and then I'm going to decrease the size of my brush because I don't want any of this sky to be revealed here. So I'm just going to erase this sky. It's okay if you erase a little bit of the mountain because the hardness of the brush is basically going to create a nice smooth edge. I'll hold the spacebar to move over. And let me decrease the brush size again, hold Control and use my mouse wheel to zoom in. Make sure we delete all of the sky portions. Hold Control and zoom in. And I'll use the spacebar to move over. And I'll hold Control and zoom in right here. So for this portion, you can kind of create your own shapes based on whatever you want, because portions of the mountain do sort of overlap right here and then go off the edge of the photo here. So we can only keep so much, which means you sort of have to just invent your own shape of the mountain here. So you can either erase part of this mountain or you can actually just keep this little bump right there. And then come over here, same thing, you can just sort of determine where you want to erase on this photo, what you want to keep, what you want to erase. But that looks cool, that looks nice in 3D right there. I'm going to hold Control and zoom in, and I'm going to increase the size of my brush and switch back over to white. You can just hit the X on your keyboard or hit that arrow right there. And right here I also want to determine what I want to keep from this mountain. So we've got a second peak here, but this one again goes way off of the edge of the image. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of bring this all in here, like so. And you may need to come over here and decrease the opacity of this just for this portion so you can see where the end of your cube is. So here's the end of our cube. Decrease the size of my brush here using the brackets on my keyboard. And make sure you are clicked on your layer mask still. Control Z. I'm actually going to hit X to switch back to black and paint this part out. So I want the end of this photo to meet with the end of the cube. That's just going to create a better illusion there. All right, so we have that corner nice and set up. So now we just need to fix this area and determine how we want the mountains to sort of roll into the end of the cube. So right now I have black as my color. I'm going to increase the size of my brush here. And we've got some sky right here that we need to get rid of. And then we can also just sort of create a hard line right here. We don't want it to be too harsh, so we might want to round out the peak right here a little bit. This part is all up to you guys and sort of your artistic vision. All right, so that looks pretty good. We can always go back and fix that a little bit later. And now I want to work on this portion. So again, I want there to be a nice transition to the corner. It doesn't have to perfectly meet up with the corner here. Let me hit X to switch over to white and decrease the size of my brush. So I just want there to be a nice transition to the corner. I'll hit the X key, and I'm just going to try to make this nice and smooth here. And I'll hold Control. I actually want to erase a good portion of this. Decrease the size of my brush. And then I'll hold Control and zoom out. And let me just fix this area right here. All right, again, we can always come back later and adjust these if we want. But now we have a nice 3D look right here. And so the top of our cube is pretty much set for now. We're gonna go back and make some more adjustments to this to make it look a little bit more realistic and to make some of the highlights and shadows kind of pop a little bit. But for now, we're just gonna leave this right here. Up until this point, we've done a lot of work on the top of the cube. We've done some work on the bottom, but we haven't done anything with the sides yet. So now I'm going to draw the sides of our cube, and I'm gonna start by coming over here and hiding the cube outline bottom layer. And I noticed something when I did that, which is that I put the fill and the outline on the same layer. So actually what I'm gonna have to do is fix this. So I'm gonna come over here to the cube fill bottom layer, come over to the paths tab again, unhide the cube bottom path, grab my path tool, click on that path, come back to the layers panel, and I will go ahead and stroke the path. I'll just hit stroke. These two should be on different layers. If they're not, just go back and do what I just did. And the names of these are now wrong, so let me just change the name of these real quick. So this one is actually the fill, and then this one is the outline. So I'll come back and hide that path. And now that we've fixed that, I'll just hide the cube fill bottom layer. All we want is the outline right here. We don't want the fill. And the next step is I have to create a new layer for the sides of the cube. So I'm going to click and create a new layer, and I'll name this cube outline side. And this is going to be the left side, so let me just add that note there. And I'll fill this with transparency and click OK. So here's that new layer. I'm going to move it to the top of the layer group. And I'm going to do the same thing, but this time for the fill. So cube fill left side. So now we have both new layers. I'm going to click on the outline left side layer to start. And now I'll come over and make sure I have my path tool selected, and I'm going to hold Control and zoom in with my mouse wheel. So what I'm going to do is create some nodes just like I did for the top and bottom of our cube. So I'm going to use the guide right here as a reference. And I'm just loosely placing these nodes right now. So I'm going to place one up here, and we're going to make sure that this is with the outline here. So here's the outline of the bottom portion of our cube. Again, if you can't see it, you can temporarily hide the ISO grid. But now I need to create a union here between the last node that I created and the first one. So I'll hold Control and click to create that union. And now I need to go ahead and move these nodes into place so that they are aligned better with the grid. Make sure you clicked on the node and not the segment, the line segment. Hold Control, zoom out. And I'm just going to put this into place. It's a little hard to tell with that photo right there, so I'll just hide that real quick. And I'm also going to come over here and unhide this portion of the grid because I do need this straight line as a reference. And then I'm going to move over, hold Control, zoom in, and just align this part. And make sure this is nice and aligned. All right, so that's looking good. So now we need to stroke the outline here. So make sure you're on your cube outline left side layer. Come over to stroke path. And keep all the settings the same and hit stroke. Just make sure that black is your foreground color. And then I'll move over to the cube fill left side layer and come over to fill path and then click fill. And now we have a fill there. So we've got the left side of our cube set up. Now we need to set up the right side. So we'll do the same thing. I'll create a new layer. And I'm just going to name these cube fill right side. And then I'm going to do cube outline right side. And now I'll just move over. Make sure I have my path tool selected again. And you might have to click off that tool real quick just to clear that other path you drew. And we're going to start off on the outline right layer. So hold Control and zoom in a bit. And I'm going to hide the fill top and the fill left side layers just so we can see the ISO grid a little bit better. So I'll click to create a node right there. And I'll loosely put one right there. And I'll click to create one here. And then I'll hold Control, create a union right there. We do need to make sure there's some overlap here, so I'm going to unhide all those fill layers real quick and turn down the opacity. And by turning down the opacity, you can see we can still see the ISO grid, but we can also see the various sides of our cube. I'll hold Control and zoom in. So we just need to align this up here. So go with right there. That actually looks pretty good. Make sure this is nice and aligned. And zoom in here, make sure this is aligned and also overlapping. All right, everything looks good, so I'm going to come back up here to the cube outline right layer and then come over here and click stroke path, and I'll click stroke, and then come over here to the fill layer, click fill path, choose solid color, click fill, and now we have both sides of our cube here. So let's come back here and turn the opacity of these layers up a little bit. And we can come back up here to the landscape layer and unhide that. All right, now we're going to bring in the photo of the dirt to place on the sides of the cube. So I'll come over here to my file folder again, and I'm just going to type in ground in the search box because I know our image contains the word ground. I'm going to click and drag this into GIMP and release it. And that'll place this inside of GIMP, and if you have to move this out of the layer group, just click and drag it to the very top. And now with my move tool selected, I'm going to click and drag this into place. And I actually need two of these layers, one for the left side and one for the right. So I'll come over here, click on this layer and duplicate it. And I'll move one of these layers over here. And let me just show and hide this so I can see which one this is. And now I'm going to change this one to say dirt right, because this will be the right side. And I'll change this one to say dirt left. And I can just hide the dirt right layer for now. Next, what I need to do is grab my perspective tool because we're going to change the perspective of the image to match the perspective of the left side of the cube. And I'm going to click on that image, and I'm going to use the isometric grid here to drag this into place. And we're going to refine this in a second here. So hold Control and zoom in. And right now we need to make sure that everything is on the same line. So I'll just drag that in a little bit there. Drag this one in, hold Control and zoom in. This part doesn't have to be completely perfect, but it will look a little bit better if you take some extra time to align this to the ISO grid. I'm going to hold the spacebar and move over. We can see that these two items are on the same line because this line right here can go through these points right here. So I'm just going to click and drag this portion down a bit until this part aligns. And I'm also making sure that this is still on this line right here. So we're making sure we're aligned on both of these parts. And you don't want the image going too far off of the side of the cube because we do want as much detail as we can keep inside of this image right here. The larger you make the image, the larger the grains of dirt will look and the less realistic this is going to look. So that looks pretty good to me, so I'll hit transform. And now we have the dirt on the left side here. And I'll come over here and do the same thing on the right. And the reason I'm going to do these relatively at the same time is I want them to be somewhat the same height and the same size in general. That's just going to make sure that the grains of dirt are the same on both sides of the cube in terms of their size. So I'll unhide the dirt right layer, use my move tool to drag this one into place now. And we may have to decrease the opacity of the left side here. So I'll move this into place, grab my perspective tool, click on this layer now. And we'll do the same thing. So again, we want these to be relatively the same size. They don't have to be exactly the same size, but the closer the better for sure. All right, once you have that in place, hit transform. And now we have the perspective for both sides of the dirt here. Now we need to clean these up, obviously, and we'll do so using the layer masks. So I'll come over here to our dirt left layer for starters and turn the opacity up. And then I'll find the cube fill left side layer right here. Hold the Alt key and click, and that'll give us a selection area. And then I'll come over to the dirt left layer, right click, go to Add Layer Mask, and choose Selection and click Add. And we'll do the same for the right side here. So we're going to hit Control-Shift-A to deselect that area. Click on the dirt right layer. Alt-click on the cube fill right side. Right-click, go to Add Layer Mask, and choose Selection again and click Add. And we'll hit Control-Shift-A to deselect that. And so now we have both sides of our cube. The issue here is that the shading looks the same in both photos because the lighting is the same in both photos. So we'll have to adjust one of the sides of our cube so that it's a little darker than the other side. In this case, I'm going to go with the right side. So I'll make sure that I'm clicked off of the layer mask on the actual photo right here. And I'll come over here to Colors, Levels. And now I can play around with the levels here and just make that side a little bit darker. I have an entire tutorial dedicated to the levels tool if you guys want to check that out. And so I'm just adjusting the arrows here. And by bringing this arrow in, we are clamping the output of the whites, which is going to make that side a little bit darker overall. So there's a before, there's an after. And once you have everything to your liking, you can click OK. And so now this side of the cube is a little bit darker than this side. We'll go back a little bit later and further refine the lighting on the sides of our cube to make this look a little bit more realistic. But real quick, what I want to do here is I want to enhance the 3D look of this cube. So what I'll do is I'll grab my paintbrush tool and I'm going to switch over to white. This time I'll make sure I'm clicked on my layer mask and I'll increase the size of my brush using the brackets on my keyboard. Hold Control and zoom in a bit. And what I'll do is I'll just mask in some of this parts of the sides of our cube. And let me just decrease the size of the brush real quick. And I'm only doing this on the parts that look a little bit raised. And the reason is that it looks like the chunk that we took out follows the topography of the actual landscape photo there. So it just looks like it's raised. And we don't want to mask anything on the corner here because that will ruin our corner, our straight corner. So I'll go right to the edge, but I won't paint past the edge there. And I'll do the same over here. Increase the size of my brush. And click on my dirt left layer mask there. So any parts that are raised, you could just paint a little bit here. You can always increase or decrease the size of your brush if it doesn't line up. And you don't want this to be too smooth because it doesn't look entirely realistic. So you want to make it look a little bit jagged there. So you can do that by increasing and decreasing the size of your brush. So hold Control and zoom in a bit. So anywhere where you see any sort of raised area, you can just perform this technique. All right, we've added to the illusion that there is raised elevation going on the sides of our cube. Now we're going to work on making it look like the river is going through parts of the soil that we can see in the chunk that we took out of the cube. So I'll come over here and create a new layer, and we'll just name this river. Fill with transparency, click OK. And I'm going to make sure my paintbrush tool is selected here, and I'll click on my landscape layer and hold Control and zoom in. And what I'll do is I'll hold the Control key and I'm going to click and grab a color from our river because we want to use the river color here. And I'm just going to move around my image a bit. And now I'll come over to our river layer again, make sure this is actually above the dirt layers. And I'm going to decrease the size of my brush a bit. And now I'm going to paint straight down so that it matches the perspective here of our dirt. And so now it looks like we have a little bit of a chunk of water right here. And I'm going to hold Control, zoom in. I'm going to do the same any parts where I see any bit of water. So that looks pretty good there. And we can do this for both sides of the cube here. So if there's any here, which this part of the river doesn't go to the end, so we don't need to do it there. But that just adds a tiny bit of detail to our 3D cube. Once I've done that, I'm going to organize our composition a bit by putting all of these elements into a single layer group. So I'll come over here, create a new layer group, and I'll come up here and I'm just going to name this cube elements and hit the enter key. And just click and drag all of these elements in the same order into the layer group. And this will come in handy a little bit later. Now it's time to use our dodge and burn tool to adjust some of the lighting, add a little bit of shading, add a little bit of highlights to the various elements of our cube. So I'll hold Control and zoom out a bit, and I'll come over here to the dodge and burn tool. And I'm going to increase the size of my brush here for now. And I'll start with the actual landscape. So I'll come over to the landscape layer. Make sure I'm clicked on that and not the layer mask. I'm just going to adjust the size of this and I'll test this out. So I'll hit Control Z. I'm going to decrease the hardness of my brush quite significantly here and also decrease the opacity. And we'll test that out. It looks a little bit better. I'm going to decrease the opacity a little bit more and actually decrease the hardness even more. So you'll just have to adjust your settings until you get them the way you want. All right, so that's starting to look pretty close here. And that looks pretty good. So we're just going to add some highlights here throughout the image. Just real small highlights. You can always increase or decrease the size of your brush. So hold Control and zoom in. I actually want to add some highlights to the river. I'll just draw this on the river. And maybe some parts right here. So any parts really where you see light hitting the landscape here, you're going to want to just sort of enhance that a little bit. Maybe even parts of the mountain here. Again, this is all part of your artistic vision. But now we're going to switch over to the burn tool, and we're just going to do the same thing except with the shadowy areas, and that's just going to add a little bit of contrast. And I actually want to, I'm going to increase this. I'm going to add some contrast where the photo kind of falls off here. And I can increase that contrast again. And then anywhere where you see shadows, you can just paint with the burn tool. Let me undo that. You don't want to overdo it. All right, so that's helped to add some contrast in here. Now we're going to do the same for the dirt layers. So I'll come over here and start with the dirt left layer. This is the lighter side of the dirt, so we don't want to add too many shadows here, but we do want to add a little bit so that it just gives it a little bit more dimension. So you can see I'm just sort of painting the shadows along the edge here, trying to lightly do so. And I'll come back up top here, increase the opacity, and just add a little bit of darkness right there, a little bit of shadows on the edge. Now hold Control and zoom in. I actually want to decrease my brush size and add some shadows around the parts of the river here. It's not doing too much right now. You can always increase the opacity. That way it just looks like the soil is almost like a little bit more damp right here. Just adds to the realism. And now I'll come over here to the right side and do the same thing. So I'll just decrease the opacity a bit, increase the size of my brush, and just add a little bit of shading there. All right, now real quick, I'll come back up to the landscape layer, and I'll come over to colors, levels, and I'm just going to adjust the levels of this photo just to help it look a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more realistic. Right now it's a bit on the bright side, and there's not as much contrast as I would like, so I'm just going to increase that contrast. So you can see there's a little more contrast now, so I'll click OK. And now I'm going to click on the layer mask and just zoom in right here, and I'm going to grab my paintbrush, switch over to black, and just make sure that we paint out this portion right here. I don't think this should be here. And you may need to turn the hardness of your brush back up. We're now going to get into creating some shadows and reflections to further enhance the realism of our composition. And so I'm going to come over here and start by clicking on my ISO grid, and I'm just going to decrease the opacity a bit. I don't want this to be as intense for this portion. And I'm going to come over to the cube fill bottom layer. This is going to be the layer we're going to use to create our drop shadow. And I'll come over to filters, light and shadow, and I'm actually going to use long shadow for this portion. So now you see we have this long shadow here. I'm going to change the style here to fading fixed length. That's going to make it have this nice fade out look here. And what I need to do is I need to change the angle of this and the length. So first I'll start with the angle. And I want this to go this way because we have the dark side of the cube right here, which means the light is coming probably from somewhere in this direction. If you get the direction right, it'll look a little bit more realistic. And I'm actually going to change this back real quick to finite so I can line this up with the grid right here. So I'm just going to adjust the angle. And I actually want to increase the length a tiny bit. So let me increase the length. But I do want to make sure that this portion of the shadow does not go past this portion of the cube. That just keeps it looking a little bit more realistic. All right, so once I have the right length, I can align it to the ISO grid here. So there we go, that looks pretty good. And now I'll come over and change this back to fading fixed length, and we can play around with the midpoint. That's just determining where the fade is going to start here. So you can see that if we drag the midpoint up a little bit, there's going to be a little bit more black right here, and I actually like the way that looks. And you can also change the color of your shadow if you want to, but I'm just going to keep it at black. So now we have our shadow. I'll click OK. I don't like how there's this harsh line right here, so I'll grab my smudge tool, and I'm going to increase the size of my brush. and maybe decrease the hardness a little bit. Zoom in, and I'm just going to smudge that line right there. I don't want to smudge it too much. Let me turn the force down a bit. You might need to just click one at a time and then click to sort of blend that. So there we go. Now I want to create the reflection that's going to go below the cube. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and duplicate the entire cube elements layer group. But I don't need all of the elements inside this layer group. I only need the dirt portions. So I'll start by deleting the river layer, and then I'll also delete the landscape layer. And I'm going to click on the cube elements copy layer group and right click and go to merge layer group. And I'm just going to name this dirt and hit enter. And actually let me name this dirt reflection. And I'm going to hit M to grab my move tool. And I'm going to click and drag this, holding the control key to stay in straight line mode. And I'll put it right about here. And there are parts that overlap, but don't worry about that. We're going to click and drag this below the layer that has the drop shadow here. So it's below the cube shapes layer group. Once I've done that, I'm going to decrease the opacity of this layer a little bit. And now I'm going to grab my eraser tool, increase the size of my brush. So I can use the slider, or I can use the left and right brackets on my keyboard. And make sure I have a nice soft brush. So I'll decrease the hardness here. And now I'm going to click on one of these lines on my isometric grid, hold the shift key, and follow the line on that grid, and then click, and you'll see that'll create a nice fade. I do have to move up a couple lines here, and that was a little bit too much, so let me just move up a little bit less. So we're creating a nice fade there, and we're going to do the same thing for this side. So we'll click on one of these lines, hold the shift key to stay in straight line mode, and then click, and then you may have to manually paint this part out. So now we have a cool reflection there. Now I'll add a drop shadow to the bottom of my cube, and I'll do that by coming over here and duplicating our cube elements layer, right click and go to merge layer group. And I'm just going to name this cube drop shadow, hit enter, and then I'll come over to filters, light and shadow, drop shadow, and you'll have to play around with the settings here to get the shadow in the right spot. I'm going to turn down the blur radius. It's a bit too high right now. So you can see right now it's offset from the corner of this part of the cube, and we don't want that, so we're going to drag this. And actually I'm just going to set this to 0. Play around with the blur radius and the opacity here. So I'll turn the opacity up. So if I hold Control and zoom out, you can see the drop shadow actually goes around the entire shape. So I'm just going to click OK for now. And I'll alt-click on the cube elements layer below, and that's going to create a nice selection area. I'll hit Control-I to invert that selection area, and I'm making sure I'm still on my cube drop shadow layer. I'll grab my eraser tool, and I'm just going to erase all the parts up here on the top because we only want the drop shadow around the bottom of the cube. So I'll zoom in a bit here, decrease the size of my brush, and I can also use the size slider to speed things up. I'm just going to erase all these excess portions of the drop shadow. You can keep that little part right there. That adds to the realism. I'm going to erase all of these portions over here. Hold Control and zoom out. Control-Shift-A. So now I'll come over here to View, Show Guides, and then come down here and hide the ISO grid. And there is our final 3D isometric map. So that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. You can visit our website at daviesmediadesign.com. You can enroll in my best-selling GIMP photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher on Udemy, and you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon, and I'll include a link to that as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.